Hello and welcome back to this reading from my book, The Seed of Yggdrasill, by yours truly, Maria Kvilhaug. And we have now reached chapter 12, the last chapter, which is titled The One and the Many, Mysteries and Pantheism in Old Norse Myths. And we're going to start with chapter 12.1, an Old Norse Mystery School, ? And it begins with a quotation from Cicero, his work Laws. Cicero was an old Roman politician and writer who lived during the age of Julius Caesar, and he was initiated into these mysteries, as many other people, known poets and scholars of the classical age were actually philosophers, even emperors like Marcus Aurelius. And I quote from his work: "And as the rites are called mysteries, so in very truth we have learned from them, the mysteries, the beginning of life. And we have gained the power not only to live happily, but also to die with a better hope." That's how he describes these mysteries and what they do for him. That the mysteries have taught him the beginnings of life and how to live happy and how to die better, or with a better hope. So I begin reading. In chapter 7.4, I discussed the initiation of classical mystery schools in connection to the initiation structure in Old Norse myth, as well as the concepts of a salvation and an alternative afterlife. During the 2nd century before Christ, an African Roman initiate of Isis, I say African Roman because he was from Algiers, which lies in North Africa, and that at the time when he lived, that part of Africa was a part of the Roman Empire. So, so this Roman Algerian initiate of the goddess Isis, well, he was named Apuleius, and he wrote his novel Metamorphosis, also known as the Golden Ass. That ass would be a donkey. Anyway, he wrote his novel Metamorphosis, or the Golden Ass, in which he tells the tale of his path towards enlightenment as an initiate of the great goddess. And in this work, the goddess Isis is referred to as a savior, and it was written 200 years before Christ. So the concept of salvation and saviors is much older than Christianity, and actually existed in pagan religions like the Roman one. So, like the myths of the mysteries, his novel is written as a metaphor, or as an allegory, and he describes how his main character, Lucius, which means light, how this character was before initiation, because he had been subjected to sorcery and suffering, and now he was walking the world as a beast, as a donkey, suffering the lack of free will in the slavery of man, of mean, ignorant and perverted people. Then one night he cannot take this humiliation and this abuse anymore, and he wants to be restored to his true human shape. The process of restoring his humanity is described as a sequence of events that is following the same carrying structure, underlying structure that we have observed in the Edda poems, as summed up in chapter 7. basically, it is the vision quest. You know, when Odin hanged for 9 nights, or when someone sat on a mound or in a grove, or or on a burial mound. All this in order to gain a vision of what they're going to do. That's how it begins, the initiation structure in the Edda poems. And in this African Roman work from 2,200 years ago, we also have a vision quest. When Lucius, Light, is desperate about his conditions as an enslaved beast. This is, of course, allegorical, a metaphor. He's like a beast, like an enslaved beast, no human anymore. Now he runs down to the shore and he sort of baptizes himself in the water 7 times while praying fervently to the goddess. And actually this is a full moon night. He goes down to the beach, he sees the full moon, he prays to the goddess Isis, and then he goes into the water and submerges himself 7 times beneath the light of the full moon. It's described in very poetical ways, and it's obviously a ritual way of addressing the goddess. And then the vision quest is go to the second stage, which is the vision. And in the Norse myths, the vision always involves a goddess or a valkyria, someone coming to show the way. And now in this older work from the Roman Empire, the vision appears as the goddess reveals herself to him, and she reveals her true nature. She reveals that she is the true face behind all the other gods and goddesses. She is all the goddesses, and she is the mother or source of all the gods. And she is the mover of the universe. It's like several pages of a grand speech from the goddess Isis of how she has been called by different names. She identifies herself with all the known goddesses of the entire world, and she announces herself as also the source of all the male gods. She's the one who moves the universe and the one who will end it. She is the great all soul of the entire world. So this is a very powerful manifestation of the goddess in this book that you would hardly believe it still existed in the Roman Empire, which was so patriarchal, but it did. Now after she has revealed who she is and what sort of power she is, she becomes more personal, because she's also his soul counterpart, and she now gives him advice as to what he's going to do next. She tells him what to do, and this is also common in the Norse myths, that for example the Valkyria gives the young seeker a quest, and her great promise is often that he will have her in the end if he can complete this quest. Her as his guide, as his protector, as his wife even, in life and in death. So what Lucius has to do, now we have reached the 3rd stage, the trial stage. So in this African Roman work, Lucius' first trial is to dare in his donkey form to approach a procession of priests. And these are priests, initiates and worshippers of the goddess Isis, while still in his shape. He's still in his shape as a mad donkey. And yet he dares to approach them. As he walks up to the priests, feeling unworthy, he eats off the flowers of Isis that the priest reaches out to him, and suddenly his human shape is restored. That moment, and that moment when they see that his human shape is restored, the moment he seeks the path of the initiation, he is accepted by the priests as a initiate, as a novice, an initiate of the goddess, as they say. The initiation process itself is so secret that no details are revealed, except for the fact, and this is where we come to the descent stage, in the Norse myths. Here we also have a descent stage, obviously, even though it's not described exactly how the ritual is conducted. It is said that Lucius walks through the gates of Persephone, which means through the gates of death. Persephone was the wife of Hades. She lived in the underworld half the time, and half the time on earth with her mother. So the gates of Persephone is a direct Roman reference to death. So he walks through these gates, he walks through the gates of death. So this is a world of the dead. And then he also says that the goddess in this darkness mercifully saves him. She declares that from now on she will guide and protect him, and she declares that he shall have a blessed life as her beloved. And she declares that at the moment of his death, when the great darkness surrounds him, she shall wait for him there like a light in the dark, like a sun at midnight. This is his consecration and his promise of salvation. Now, the Isis mysteries in Rome. Of course, most of you know that the goddess Isis came from Egypt, not from Rome. But the goddess Isis was so popular in Egypt. She was said to actually come from Ethiopia originally. She says so herself in her revelation, in Lucius at least. And well, she said she didn't say that she came from Ethiopia, because obviously she was like the source of the universe, so she was an all universal goddess, which is why she could probably be adapted so many other places. But she was she says that her first temples of initiation began in Ethiopia, and then they came into Egypt. And then when Rome took over Egypt, actually the Hellenes, the Greeks actually took over Egypt first, with the Ptolemies during the age of Alexander the Great. So Egyptian religion was already quite known and influential in the Hellenistic Empire, which preceded the Roman one, and which was also very big. So the Hellenic Empire was more like a Bronze Age empire, which included Egypt and many, many countries around the Mediterranean and all the way to India, actually. And then the Romans took over, and they also included the entire Mediterranean area, including Egypt. And I think they focused more on the West than the Greeks had done. They focused more on taking over the western parts of the world. So they went into Britain, as we know. But anyway, during all these many, many centuries of a very, well, it wasn't completely global, but at that age it was quite a global scale civilization that reached into Africa, Asia and Europe. And during these centuries of huge, enormous empires and a lot of contact between the different parts of the known world to them, the goddess Isis and her religion, or her cult, as they say, or her school is perhaps a better word, her school of initiation, had reached all over the place, including and become extremely popular in the Roman Empire. Her school of initiation was not the only one. There were lots of schools of initiation. All of them had a sort of pantheistic streak, which means that they all believed that all the different gods and goddesses were real, but they were also sort of sharing a common source origin, that they were part of something bigger, that they were sort of only different avatars of a single primeval power, which could be any of them, but they usually identified this primeval power with a particular deity, mostly a female deity, a sort of mother of all the other ones, the mother of the universe. So Isis was very popular. Another one which was more native to Europe was the cult of Demeter in Eleusis outside of Athens, also very old and with roots into the Minoan culture of Crete, Bronze Age Crete. And very much the same concept. And in the Book of Isis, in Apuleius' work, Isis identifies herself with Demeter. They are basically the same. So they didn't mind having different names for the one source of all the others. They just chose one for simplicity, but they also recognized that she could appear in different names and with different shapes to different people. In any case, let's move back to reading. The Isis mysteries in Rome were greatly influenced by the Greek mysteries of Eleusis, which were thought to have been established by the goddess Demeter. We do not know the exact details of the initiations. The reason why so many people who took these initiations and who could write didn't actually write about the mysteries or just wrote about them in hints like Cicero did. Well, the reason is that it was actually forbidden to reveal what really happened during the initiation. You could sort of describe it on an existential, spiritual level, but you couldn't actually say what exactly happened. So we do not know the exact details of the initiation, apart from what we can gather from the text sources and the archaeological digs. The Eleusinian mysteries included a 9-day also repeats itself in the Norse initiation stories, but it was a 9-day ceremony where the initiate would fast and relive the suffering of the goddess. This was the goddess Demeter, when she was searching for her daughter. In the Isis cult, it's a similar scenario, but a little bit different. Isis is searching for her brother, who is also her husband, of course, Osiris. And he's sort of scattered all over the world. In any case, we do not know the exact details of the initiation, but the Eleusinian mysteries included a 9-day ceremony where the initiates would fast and relive the suffering of the goddess in the myth when she was searching for her daughter. You remember I talked about how these men hanging in the grove of Uppsala for 9 days and nights, well, they could have been sacrificed probably to Odin, who also hung for 9 days, but it could be that they were also trying to relive his trial and reach the same knowledge. And anyway, this part where you fast and relive the suffering of the goddess, or the character that is the first one to go through these trials, this could be seen as the vision quest. And the identification with the goddess and her original archetypal trials. So the initiation itself was described as an encounter with death and a salvation at the hands of the goddess. Also, the drinking of kykeon, a particular precious drink, and the entering of a marriage bed was also a part of the ritual. We know all these. So all the elements that we know about, they fit perfectly well into the Norse initiation stories. Initiates reported that they had seen light in the darkness. You know, the golden realm of the Maiden with the Mead in the darkest, pitched dark parts of hell, where she awaits with a Mead. Well, Initiates reported that they'd seen a light in the darkness, the sun by midnight, and that their perception of life and death was changed forever after the initiations. And was this just for the rich or wealthy, the people who became philosophers and politicians back then? They were usually rich and wealthy. Well, actually, the Temple of Demeter was very unelitistic. Thousands of people of all classes, even slaves, all genders, anyone could, if they wanted, attend the annual initiation ceremonies together, which were sponsored. These initiations were so important that they were sponsored by the Athenian government for more than 1,000 years. It reaches back into the Bronze Ages and all the way until the Christian age, when baptized Christian Goths actually destroyed the temple in 391. It had been there for at least 1,500 years, maybe more, and had even older roots. So it was sponsored by the government, and people would come on a pilgrimage from all over the ancient world in order to attend these mysteries. People traveled from far and wide to reach Eleusis and attend these ceremonies. It was important. It was like the stone, the Kaaba in Mecca for pagans back then, and they could come from many, many, many different places. We know that people from the north even came down to these areas, so why not? Yet, we also know that apart from these grand publicly available to everyone mysteries, there were two higher mysteries for those who were particularly inclined to go even deeper than the first level. So there were 3 levels. The Old Norse mysteries, if there were any, must have resembled the ancient mysteries and been deeply influenced by them. I assume that they existed, because I can find no better explanation as to why the Old Norse myths are carried by almost identical structures and descriptions as the ancient initiates dared to reveal in writing. You couldn't reveal much. You had to reveal it in hinty, metaphorical ways, which is why all the things that's written about it is written in metaphorical, allegorical ways that will only be understood by an initiate. So there are these myths that can be understood. These Romans and Greeks, they wrote about this. We know this, that they knew that a myth, a story, has several levels, several layers. On the first, it's a story that is entertaining, and you can tell it to your children, or you can tell it in a feast to entertain people. And then there are other levels that you can go through. You will only see if you have the experience that is required to understand the deeper meaning of the stories. They worked on several levels. So, the Old Norse mysteries, if there were any, must have resembled the ancient mysteries and been deeply influenced by them. I am actually completely certain about this. I assume these ancient mysteries in the north also existed because I can find no better explanation as to why the Old Norse myths are carried by almost identical structures and descriptions as the ancient initiates dared to reveal in writing. The carrying ritual structure of the myths, the saviour goddess who appears as a light in the darkness, the magical number 9, the precious drink and the sacred marriage, as well as the idea of a supreme being with whom the individual souls must strive to be reunited with, are all common themes, both in the Old Norse poems and in the writings of those ancients who attended the mysteries. The Greek-Roman world was a complex world in which religion was multifaceted and polytheistic. This is the same as in the Old Norse world. In both pagan worlds, people carried out numerous different rites and ceremonies. Some people, or even some areas or regions, would attend to particular deities with their own particular cults. There were great public cults, there were local cults, there were military cults, cults of the home. People could attend to many different cults or concentrate on some in particular. They were quite free about it. There were no dogmas, no thought police, no belief police. They just attended what they were raised to attend or what they felt particularly inclined to attend. And they could completely well combine many different ones. So there were numerous kinds of different religious officials, some more specialized than others. There were also oracles, wise women, healers, witches, and sorcerers operating on their own or in guilds, perhaps connected to particular cults. So far, the pagan Old Norse and the pagan Greek-Roman worlds shared exactly the same basic traits in this respect. What I just described could be describing both kinds of cultures. And then there were the mystery schools, whose attendees used ancient myths as metaphors to explain the secrets of their mysteries, the quest of the soul for immortality and union with the divine. These cults were based around particular temples that were often pilgrimage sites or goals for pilgrims, such as Eleusis, and anyone could attend ceremonies there or come to pray at the shrines and receive help from the priests and the priestesses. In that way, the mystery temples served as common public religious centers for the benefit of local worshippers. But they were also the centers for the great mysteries, to which people who were so inclined would travel far and wide in order to save their souls. We know that this was the case in the Hellenistic and Roman empires, and that some cults date back into prehistory. But was it the case in the Old Norse world? We cannot know that for sure, but we could ask ourselves whether the Old Norse peoples only worshipped in groves and little shrines, or whether there was any great public temple that ever served as a grand religious center and goal of pilgrimage during pagan times, and which could have been the center of such mysteries. Indeed, there was at least one, the Temple of Uppsala, as we shall see in section 12.2. Before we take a closer look at this possible center of pagan initiations and mysteries, we shall go a little further back in time, when it is said that the goddess Isis was worshipped in Germany, or among the Germans. So, just a moment. This is actually a transcript from a video. I'm going to put that transcript in, that video in, and then I'm going to go read chapter 12.2, Temple of Uppsala.
Hi, today I'm going to discuss a matter of comparative mythology, that of classical mystery religions in the Greek-Roman world and possible Old Norse and Germanic mystery traditions. This subject is enormous and could be the subject of a whole book, which it will be if I can get it right, so this little video will just be a small and very limited introduction. I'm going to begin with a text written around the year 80 AD, that is almost 2000 years ago. The author was the Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus, who wrote a little summary about what the Romans at the time knew of their German neighbors. Now, despite the occasional bloodshed and warfare between Rome and Germany, a lot of the interaction between the two people was actually peaceful, involving trading and visiting. Now, from this interaction, information about German tribes and their religions and customs seeped into the Roman Empire. And one of the many interesting things that Tacitus claimed was this: the Suebi make sacrifice to Isis. And stop there. First, who were the Suebi? They were a large alliance between various tribes that considered themselves related to each other, a whole cluster of tribes that dominated what today is known as Central Germany and Denmark, and just outside the borders of the empire. So we go again. 2000 years ago, according to contemporary sources, Isis was worshipped in Central Germany. Isis, an African goddess with roots in Ethiopia and Egypt. Now that's a bit odd, isn't it? Well, it's odd. It's not impossible, not really. The goddess Isis had been worshipped in Ethiopia and Egypt for thousands of years already. When Alexander the Great annexed Egypt into his Hellenistic Empire, later to be taken over by the Romans, the extremely ancient religion of Isis seeped into the Mediterranean world. By the time Tacitus wrote in 80 AD, the religion of Isis was among the most popular cults in the whole empire, reaching all its corners, and this empire was huge. So, and for the last couple of thousand of years, we have seen how religions that began as local cults spread out into all the world. So, it is definitely not impossible that the religion of Isis could have reached as far as central Germany. But the strange things about this idea are, one, Germany was outside of the empire, and two, the Germans seem to be very devoted to ancestral tribal cults, and three, there is no archaeological evidence for actual Isis worship in Germany, and four, like all Romans, Tacitus believed that people all over the world worship the same gods and goddesses, only by different names. So he thought it was perfectly valid to translate the names of barbarian gods into the Roman or Greek equivalents. And he based that on the particulars of the cults and the attributes of the gods to identify the gods. So following this rule, Tacitus claimed that the Germans worshipped Mercury, which in reality was Wodan or Odin, and that they worshipped Mars, which in reality was the god Tivas or Tyr, and to Jupiter, which in reality was Thonar or Thor. So what we are looking at is probably Tacitus's way of saying that the Germans had a religion that was very similar to the goddess, to the religion of the goddess Isis, and that they worshipped a goddess very much like Isis. And seeing as he chose Roman names for the barbarian gods, we must ask ourselves why he did not choose a Roman goddess to describe this German goddess. Why did he not use Juno, or Venus, or Vesta, or Proserpina, or Gaia? Why? Why this foreign goddess Isis? Why was she the most similar goddess to the one worshipped by the Central Germans? Historians generally agree that the reason he believed they worshipped Isis was because that there is archaeological evidence that the German goddess was worshipped widely in central Germany at the time, and one of her important attributes was a ship, just like with Isis. Now, I think that's a bit too simple. Because when he said Isis, he would give a lot of associations to his Roman audience, and he didn't just do that carelessly. I think we need to consider what Isis was in the Roman world. At the time Tacitus was writing, a pantheist philosophy had for a long time been extremely common throughout the empire. Pantheism means that people who worship gods and various gods and goddesses believe that all these gods and goddesses are individual aspects of a unifying whole, a supreme being. Most pantheists claim to know exactly which one deity really covers all the others, and at the time of Tacitus, it was widely believed that Isis was the one true supreme being behind all the other gods and goddesses. The one supreme being in which all the others come together as one. So she was the great goddess, first among heavenly beings, the mother of the universe, whom even the gods revere. So, another relevant attribute of the pantheist Isis religion is that it was one of the great classical mystery religions and had initiation rituals at its core. Other important mystery religions was that of the ancient Greek goddess Demeter and that of the ancient Anatolian goddess Cybele. They all had great goddess pantheism and mystery initiation as core attributes. In all of them, initiation rituals took place. Anybody could worship the great goddess in her temple, but some people would have a special passion, a vocation, and would become initiated into the secrets of immortality that the goddess presided over. Anyone, man or woman, slave or free, if only they knew the language and did not have a criminal record, could apply for permission to become initiated. And among those who underwent initiation were famous Roman orators, philosophers, and emperors. Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, yeah, well, many of them. The initiation involves several steps. First, the initiate had to purify himself or herself and pray for visions. When the goddess appeared in their visions, she would give them permission to proceed with the ceremonies. Now, the initiations were secret, and to the uninitiated could only be revealed through poetical metaphors. And these metaphors show that one experienced a sort of voluntary death, a journey through the underworld, and that the great goddess would appear as a light within the utter darkness of death and save the soul through resurrection. People who came out of the mystery halls after initiation claimed that they had been reborn and no longer feared death, and that they had been given deep insights into the nature of existence and the meaning of life and death. All this happened through the grace of the great goddess, and the union with her as the origin of all souls was sometimes described through metaphors as a marriage. Now, if any of you have seen my previous videos in this series, you may guess where I'm going now. This is comparative mythology from the classical world, showing a basic structure of initiation which is more or less identical to that which I claim exists in the Poetic Edda. Now, the Viking Age poets describe the vision quest that caused a vision of the goddess, the subsequent journey into the underworld where the initiate experience a death, and then a resurrection through the marriage with the goddess, who appear as a golden light within the utter darkness of hell. Usually, a drink is served to consecrate the hero and offer him wisdom. We do not know if that was part of the mystery initiation of Isis, but it was certainly a part of the mystery initiation of the Mead, where the drink was called Kykayon. Now, the Suebi tribes of central Germany 2000 years ago had the religion centered around a goddess, and I think that this religion and the goddess herself may have been basically similar to that of Isis, meaning that we're not talking about the African Isis herself, but about a mystery cult which included a goddess whose attributes were that of a great goddess, covering other goddess attributes. That it's centered around initiation. Now, the next question is, was there a native German goddess that could fit this description? Historians usually think that the goddess described as Isis was in reality Nehalenia, who was widely worshipped in Germany at the time. She may be identical to the goddess Nertus, the mother of the gods, who was worshipped by one of the Suebi tribes, and whom most linguists believe is the female version of the Norse god Njordr, who was said to have a sister with whom he begot Freyr and Freyja. Let us have a look at Nehalenia and see if she could possibly be perceived as a great goddess. I cannot prove this, and I don't have time to prove this, but I can point out to many attributes of Nehalenia that resemble a whole ensemble of later Viking Age goddesses. 1. The ship. From the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, the ship was an important symbol of the afterlife journey, and from European mythologies we know that the journey to the other side is often happening by ship, and that there is a ferryman, or indeed a ferrywoman. Nehalenia is shown as a woman steering a ship. Another goddess associated with the ship during the Bronze Age in Scandinavia is the sun. Yes, some of you might think that just because the Greeks and Romans believed that the sun was masculine, everybody else did too. Actually, around the whole northern part of this globe, a feminine sun is the rule, not the exception. And in the Germanic languages, the sun is a feminine noun, and in Norse mythology there is no doubt whatsoever that the sun is a lady. She even gives birth. Now, the sun was the center of worship in Scandinavia during the Bronze Age, no surprise there, and three major male gods who were phallic figures carrying either a spear, a sword, or a battle axe all seem to center around the sun disk. Spear, sword, and battle axe are attributes later associated with Odin, Freyr, and Thor. Now, to cut it short, the sun goddess was the object of reverence and rituals, even from the other gods who sought to unite with her, just like Odin, Freyr, and Thor all go through initiation rituals in which they receive knowledge from a bright golden lady whose arms illuminate the ocean and the land. The sun is also known as Alfredul, the Elfshine. And that leads us to the second attribute of German Iron Age goddess Nehalenia, the basket of fruits that she owns. And the Norse goddess associated with fruits is Idun, whose name may mean the returning one. She keeps the apples of immortality and resurrection, which the gods need to stay immortal. There is only one myth about Idun, and that explains how dependent the other gods were on her, as when she is abducted, they grow old and would have died if the goddess had not been restored. So that she is sort of identical with the apples may be indicated in the poem known as the Odin's Raven spell song, where she is called the seed of Yggdrasill, the world tree. She's also called the oldest and the youngest. And it is said that she is of elfkin. Notice their resemblance to Elfshine, the sun goddess. Now, third attribute of Nehalenia is the dog that accompanies her. In Norse mythology, the dogs and the wolves are the residents of Hel and accompany the lady of the underworld. This makes sense when we look at the three possible meanings of the name Nehalenia. One meaning is, well, to kill. That reminds us of the Norse goddess Skadi, whose name means harm or injury, and she was widely worshipped in Scandinavia. The other meaning is to hide, which reminds us of Hel, the goddess of death, whose name means exactly the same, to hide. The third possible meaning is goddess of seafaring. Now that reminds us of Ran, the goddess of the ocean, but it could also remind us of one of Freya's name, which is Mardalr, and means the great ocean. As seafaring was what happened when traveling from life to death. We must also assume that it could be a metaphor for the death journey, and that the goddess guided this journey. Oh, I have to finish soon, but I would also like to point out that Nehalenia was part of a trinity, just like the three Norns. And all these things go to show that this Iron Age goddess, who seemed so similar to great goddess Isis of the mystery initiation, could actually have been worshipped as a great goddess in Germany, since her attributes cover all the major female superpowers of later Viking Age Scandinavia. And I already talked about how they all come together in one being, Freya, the lady. So when Tacitus talked about Isis, he may very well simply have been telling us that the Germans worshipped the great goddess, and that her religion was a sort of mystery religion with initiation and pantheism at its heart and core. So,
12.2 The Temple of Uppsala. Old Norse myths show several interesting similarities to classical mystery schools, especially to those dedicated to the oldest of goddesses, Demeter from Eleusis, Greece, and Isis from North Africa, Egypt, and Ethiopia. References to castration of initiates in Old Norse myths, particularly regarding the character Sinfjötli in the Helgi Hundingsbani poems and the name Jalkir, castrate for Odin, may even bring to mind the mysteries of Kybele or Kubaba or Cybele, who was called Magna Mater, the Great Mother, by the Romans, who had adopted her religion too as their own. She was more from the east. And the latter goddess, Kubaba, Cybele, the Magna Mater, Great Mother, she was depicted flanked by two felines, or drawn in a chariot by two great cats. And this is an iconography which has persisted in this region since the early Neolithic ages. From Anatolia and into the Middle East, we find this image of a goddess being pulled in a chariot by two felines, two big cats. And this image goes all the way back into the Stone Age, where we find often enthroned goddesses flanked by two cats. So it is interesting indeed that in the Gylfaginning, Snorri claimed that Freya was drawn in a chariot by two large cats during Baldur's funeral. This castration, whether real or probably symbolic, this apparently happened in connection to Seiðr, and we know that Freya in the Old Norse sources is the origin of Seiðr. She was the one who taught it first to Odin, who was her apprentice, actually, a fact often overlooked. The Old Norse myths show a basic structure and a focus on themes that are strikingly similar to those of ancient mystery schools, particularly to the initiation structure of the mysteries of Isis that was revealed by Apuleius during the 2nd century before Christ. In my opinion, it is highly probable that Scandinavia had a mystery school of its own. It may have been very old indeed. There are indications that the mystery schools were already flourishing during the Bronze Ages in the Mediterranean areas. We're talking 4,000 to 5,000 years back in time. And we know with certainty that Scandinavia also had an old and strong connection to this part of the world during that era. The Scandinavian people actually traveled all the way down to the Mediterranean, to Southern Europe, Middle East and North Africa during the Bronze Ages 4,000 years ago. They had big ships. They even talk now about a previous Viking age, a Bronze Age Viking age, where people either went on piracy raids or just as easily just on trading tours. They had contact to this part of the world for thousands of years. And we're speaking of intense contact, a lot of influence and interaction going on. So it is entirely possible, even probable, that the mystery cults that flourished during this age, already from the Bronze Ages and into the Iron Ages, it is entirely probable that Scandinavian people were influenced by this and came across this and knew about it and even perhaps made pilgrimage down south to partake in these initiations. Yeah, so it may have been very old indeed. It is highly probable that Scandinavia had a mystery school of its own. There are indications that mystery schools were already flourishing during the Bronze Ages in the Mediterranean areas, and we know with certainty that Scandinavia had an old and strong connection to this part of the world during that era. However, an Old Norse mystery school may also have been one adopted from a classical school and then adapted to Old Norse cultural and mythological contexts. This kind of flexibility would have been typical of the mystery schools, which professed that the great goddess showed herself with different names and different shapes among different people and in different languages. Yet she was ultimately always the same. And this, many of you probably have seen read the Sandman comic books by Neil Gaiman. There's even a filmatization about it, and he stresses the fact that all these mythical characters and these dream, delusion, they look a certain way in the comics, but they will look different to different people. To a cat, dream looks like a cat. To a African prince's dream looks like an African prince, and they all look different to different people, and people understood that back then too. That a deity looks and sounds and has a name that is a reflection of the people who worship them. Because they have to be, because they believe that their gods were real, and a real deity, like a real thunder god, is obviously the thunder god of the whole world. You don't have a thunder god here in this country and then a different thunder god in another country. There is only the one thunder god. Same with the earth. There is only one earth goddess, but she has different names among different people, and so we move on around. So this kind of flexibility would have been typical of the mystery schools, which professed that the great goddess showed herself with different names and different shapes. Snorri also claimed in the Gylfaginning that Freya was a goddess who took upon herself a new name and a new shape wherever she came among different peoples. So, like the goddesses of the mystery schools, Freya was also searching for a lost beloved. This is always the same in these stories. There is somehow always this goddess searching and weeping for someone she loves who has been lost. We have Demeter looking for her daughter, we have Isis looking for her brother, and we have Freya looking for her lost husband. And they all weep a lot. She was searching for a lost beloved, an allegory for the all souls' search for its own wholeness, shattered into billions of individual souls. And this is, for example, in the Isis and Osiris myth, Isis is looking for her brother, husband, who has been killed and chopped into lots of different pieces that have been scattered all around the world. And she travels all around the world to pick up these pieces and stitches him back together and makes him whole again, almost whole, except that he has now lost his dick, which is interesting with the castration theme thing. It's a symbolic, always symbolic this, and what it meant to the mystery initiates is quite clear. It meant that the all soul, the singular source of all souls, is out there searching for her lost counterpart, a part of herself, a counterpart, and these lost, shattered pieces of her counterpart are us, the souls of the living. We are all really supposed to be back into the unity of the counterpart of the all soul, the individual soul in union with the all soul. So that's why we are seeking her too, but we have been lost, so she sort of has to find us. In any case, the search of the goddess is an allegory for the search of its own wholeness, shattered into billions of individual souls. The importance of the initiation lore and the resurrection theme in Old Norse myths is so crucial and central that, in my opinion, it must have originated in a school of thought that was well established and powerful enough to shape the mythology of an entire culture. If one such school existed, it would have had at least one powerful center, a publicly or nationally sponsored temple complex and center of pilgrimage, like that of Eleusis in Greece. Indeed, there was one place that, in my opinion, could possibly have nurtured such a center, namely the Temple of Uppsala in Sweden. Old Uppsala is situated a few kilometers north of the modern city of Uppsala in Sweden. It is famous for having been a large pagan cult center and for its 3 great burial mounds that are aligned and oriented towards where the sun sets on the 3rd of November and the 8th of February. The pagan New Year happened after the first new moon after the 21st of October, so that the first full moon would happen around the 4th of November. 3 lunar months later, on the 8th of February, the sun would again set on the direction to which the mounds were oriented. 3 lunar months later, on the 29th of April, the sun would rise in the exact opposite direction. All these dates seem to have been connected to important pagan festivals at Uppsala. During the full moon that occurred between the 28th of January and the 26th of February, an important ritual would take place for 9 days and nights devoted to the Disir, the goddesses. 9 days and nights. There was a temple of the Dis at Yggdrasill, the temple of the goddess that served as a focal point for this ritual. It was a grand public event, and the kings and the chiefs were expected to partake in the ritual. We know very little of the ritual itself, except that it included a sacrifice and that the king was expected to consecrate the site by riding around the temple of the goddess. A Dis-ting is held in Sweden at Old Uppsala to this day, which is now just an annual market, but named after the pagan Disating, which means the assembly or the parliament of the goddesses. while the only aspect of this event to survive into our day is the market that was certainly also held during pagan days. This market once took place with a great political and religious backdrop. Here, the Viking Age aristocracy would meet to hold a national parliament dedicated to the goddesses, just like the gods of the myths held a parliament at the Well of Origin, the abode of the Norns, the fate goddesses. The assembly or the parliament of the Swedes was held in conjunction with the Disablot, which means the sacrifice to the goddesses. And there were celebrations and a grand public fair or market associated with it. The latter tradition, and here's some sentence was, the latter tradition surviving unto this day. Snorri describes the custom in his Heimskringla from 1225 AD. In Sweden, it was the old custom, as long as heathenism prevailed, that the chief sacrifice took place in Goe month, that is around February, at Uppsala. Then sacrifice was offered for peace and victory to the king, and thither came people from all parts of Sweden. All the assemblies, all the parliaments of the Swedes also were held there, and markets and meetings for buying, which continued for a week. And after Christianity was introduced into Sweden, the assemblies and fairs were held there as before. After Christianity had taken root in Sweden, and the king would no longer dwell in Uppsala, the market time was moved to Candlemas, and it has since continued so, and it lasts only 3 days instead of 9. As to the 3 burial mounds, we do not know exactly how old they are or what purpose they served, but their alignment and orientation towards important ritual dates are the same as the orientation of other Swedish passage graves. And the tradition of this alignment of mounds dates back to at least 3,300 before Christ. There was, so we find that all the way back into the Stone Ages of Scandinavia, we see that these alignments were marked in Swedish passage graves and mounds. There was a well-developed and prosperous society around the Uppsala mounds during the early Iron Ages. At least, since the time immemorial, the kings had their estates here, and the Swedes gathered here to worship. There is a long-lived myth about the 3 mounds containing the remains of pagan gods, which is not actually true, but there is a myth about it. The East Mound was said to be Odin's mound, while the West Mound was Thor's, and the Middle Mound belonged to Freyr, the main god of the Ynglingar who long ruled in Uppsala. In 1874, the East and the West Mound were excavated, apparently only revealing that those buried there had been influential and prominent people, but otherwise little is known about them. Snorri wrote that Freyr had built the temple of Uppsala as his abode. Freyr was the most important deity in Sweden and said to be the ancestor of the royal lines there. We read, Freyr built a great temple at Uppsala and made it his chief seat, and gave it all his taxes, his lands, and his goods. Then began the Uppsala domains, which have remained ever since. But after Freyr was buried under a cairn at Uppsala, many chiefs raised cairns, that is mounds, as commonly as stones, to the memory of their relatives. Snorri's older contemporary, the Danish scholar Saxo Grammaticus, confirms the notion that Freyr was said to have established at the centre at Uppsala. he writes, also Freyr, the regent of the gods, took his abode not far from Uppsala, where he exchanged for a ghastly and infamous sin offering the old custom of prayer by sacrifice, which had been used by so many ages and generations. For he paid to the gods abominable offerings by beginning to slaughter human victims. Now, the reason why Snorri is a much better read than Saxo Grammaticus is because Snorri, he just describes how it was. He doesn't condemn or judge, while Saxo Grammaticus can't really write a sentence about the older religion without coming with a moral preaching about the abominations. But still, his source is also entertaining and a very informative, a good additional source text that where you have to sort of just really peel away the Christian layers, but he does tell some very old stories too. So Saxo was, as one may notice, less than favourably inclined towards the pagan gods. He continues to tell the story of the hero Starkadr, who came to Uppsala and was appalled, because when stationed at Uppsala at the time of the sacrifices, he was disgusted by the effeminate gestures and the clapping of the mimes on the stage, and the unmanly clatter of bells. Basically, he saw mimes on a stage. He saw people reenacting the myth on stage, like theatre, and they were unmanly. They had feminine gestures, and they were clapping, and they were clattering bells, which was considered apparently unmanly, at least by Saxo Grammaticus, who was a Christian moralistic writer of the 13th century. So, as disgusted as Saxo was, we may read something valuable from his information, mainly that there was a mime stage, a theatre stage, at Uppsala. The mime stage means that it is possible that myths were played, reenacted, as in what could have been mystery plays, because we know this also from the old Roman or Greek-Roman mystery cults, that the myths were in fact reenacted on stage. The actors or the participants appear to have been playing music and dancing or moving in a way that, at least to an outsider of the new school of continental Christianized machismo, well, they thought they were effeminate and unmanly. Since the pagans were doing it and they were still big, strong, masculine warriors, I think that it was not actually considered unmanly, or at least not so shocking to the pagans who attended these ceremonies. So, saying that, I think that, as I talked about before, there is a lot indicating that a certain a theme of transformation, of transcending the self and becoming like the opposite of yourself, something else, either an animal or even the opposite gender or someone of a different rank, was a part of ritual, especially of teaching rituals like initiation rituals. So that is why probably in ritual settings you would suddenly see people, men for example, acting in ways that, at least from the outside, from the Christian point of view, seemed effeminate and unmanly, and they didn't see the point in this. They just saw that it was challenging the paradigms of perception. So they didn't like that. They didn't like this opening of the mind through being something, or through transforming or transcending something in yourself. They just saw it as, moralistically bad. In the previous chapter, we mentioned how transgender behavior may have been a part of the initiation rituals. Initiates like Thor, Helgi, and Odin, at least, would don the garments of women and pretend to be serving maids, witches, or even brides in order to reach their spiritual goals. This was a powerful transgression of gender roles that was designed to perhaps humiliate, perhaps to challenge the self-importance of the initiate, or else in order to access some power that had to do with femininity and the womb. And remember the term Seiðr, that means a womb by magic. So, and it was applied to practitioners who didn't really have a womb without magic. The Golden Hall of the Maiden. Adam of Bremen, a German chronicler of the 11th century, that would be the year 1000 something, and quite early in the year 1000. Well, he wrote an account of the temple at Uppsala based on other accounts by witnesses that were there when Uppsala was still a pagan center. So I read. At this point, I shall say a few words about the religious beliefs of the Swedes. That nation has a magnificent temple which is called Uppsala. In this temple, built entirely of gold, the people worship the statues of 3 gods. A general festival for all the provinces of Sweden is customarily held at Uppsala every 9 years. Participation in this festival is required of everyone. Those who have already adopted Christianity buy themselves off from these ceremonies. The sacrifice is as follows. Of every kind of male creature, 9 victims are offered. Their bodies, moreover, are hanged in a grove which is adjacent to the temple. This grove is so sacred to the people that the separate trees in it are believed to be holy because of the deaths of the sacrificial victims. There, even dogs and horses hang beside human beings. The incantations, however, which are usually sung in the performance of a libation of this kind, are numerous and disgraceful, and it is better not to speak of them. So, again, these their morals take away the fun part of this read. They don't actually write them down. I don't know if some of you saw this video I made on Patreon. In the Fjölkingi series, especially the Witches and Warriors series, where which number was that again? Well, anyway, Busla's prayer. There is this witch woman called Busla, and the story is written. Yeah, it's the saga of Bosi and Harald. Yeah, one of the sagas that I described in the Witches and Warriors part of the Fjölkingi series, which you can find here. I'll try to link it. In any case, Busla is a witch, and she is performing a terrible curse in order to make a king obey her, and she does this while not even inside her body. She comes outside of her body into the king's chamber and starts to curse him. And this is when the writer is obviously the one who wrote down the saga is really well, he's Christian, of course. This was written down in the 13th, 14th centuries. So this monk, probably, maybe a young novice monk, he's like, I shouldn't say what this spell is. I shouldn't say it. And usually when you hear this in ancient literature, where this Christian person said, I shouldn't say this because it's not good for Christians to hear about it. They're very rude. They're very immoral, very sinful, and then they don't write it. But in this particular writer, he just couldn't help himself, and I shouldn't write this, but it sounded like this, and then he actually renders the entire curse, which several verses, and it's really funny, and I wish all the other writers had done that, but they usually didn't. So basically we just hear that There are songs, there are incantations, they are sung in the performance of a libation or during a sacrifice, and they are numerous, and they are disgraceful, and it's better not to speak of them, and sadly enough he sticks to his promise that he shouldn't speak of them. I wish more of them had been like the writer of the Bosi and Harald saga. Now, near that temple is a very large tree with widespread branches which are always green, both in winter and summer. What kind of tree this is, nobody knows. There is also a spring there where the pagans are accustomed to perform sacrifices and to immerse a human being alive. As long as his body is not found, the request of the people will be fulfilled. A golden chain encircles the temple and hangs over the gables of the building. Those who approach can see this golden chain gleam from afar because the shrine, which is located on a plain, is encircled by mounts really, so situated as to give the effect of a theatre. For 9 days, feasts and sacrifices of this kind are celebrated. Every day they sacrifice one human being in addition to the other animals, so that in 9 days there are 72 male victims which are sacrificed. This sacrifice takes place about the time of the vernal equinox. So, we do not know if these accounts are exactly true, since they are all written down by Christian outsiders who never actually been there themselves and observed the temple of the rituals. However, through these filters, several elements from the mythology emerge. Firstly, the temple site is connected to the worship of the goddesses, the Disir, and also to the one single Dis, the one goddess. The Disir is a word that covers all the numerous female powers, whether they are giantesses, goddesses, valkyries, or Norns. So a Dis can be any kind of female superpower. It can even be used about particular women that are sort of exalted. In the myth, we have seen that the role of the consecrating maiden with the Mead, who takes the initiate into her sacred embrace, may be played by a giantess, a goddess, a valkyria, or a Norn. They all come together in the concept of Disir, and probably they all come together in the one great Dis, Freya, whose name is not really a name, it's a title, very befitting a typical great goddess of mystery cults, namely just the lady, the sovereign. Moreover, the temple is said to be all golden, surrounded by a golden chain that glimmers and shines and might be seen from afar. This is exactly how the hall of the Maiden with the Mead is described in the myth. It is also standing on a plain surrounded by mountains. In the myth we have seen how the heroes must ascend mountains in order to look down into the great land of the goddesses. We learn about the resplendent fields, the crystal fields, and the plain of the undying ones, and so forth. People travel far and wide to get to the temple, just as initiates would have to travel long distances to get to the Golden Hall. And as we saw in the mystery schools of the southern part of the world, people also traveled far away to get to the Temple of the Mysteries. The rituals lasted for 9 days and nights, just as the initiation in the myths lasts for the same duration of time, and which we heard also the mysteries of the Mead in Greece. There is a grove dedicated to a sacred tree and a lake which can only resemble the world tree or the tree of memory and the well of origin. Both the Håramål and the Fjørsvinnsmål emphasize the presence of a sacred tree in this realm, standing on a sacred mound. And in the latter poem, the Fjörsinsmål, the tree of memory, the Mima Meidr, is growing out of the halls of the Maiden, the great Maiden. According to Adam of Bremen, the lake was used for a drowning sacrifice, which was the kind of sacrifice that has been connected with goddess worship since at least the Iron Age, and probably earlier. Mostly drowning was drowning the victim of sacrifice was something that was particularly associated with a female deity. Tacitus, writing in the 1st century AD, described how people were sacrificed to the great mother of the gods, Nerthus, by drowning them in a lake. However, what is described as a drowning sacrifice in severely hostile sources may easily have also perhaps been cleansing rituals where the initiates reenacted a myth of being transformed in the well of origin, a sacred water from which anyone, according to Snorri, would re-emerge transparent and shining, resurrected and transformed into a different kind of being that is transparent and shining. Another sacrifice that is described in the sources at Uppsala is the hanging sacrifice, where 9 human males were sacrificed alongside male animals. Just a moment. Now, we have touched upon sacrifice as a way for the one sacrificing to unite with the dying victim in order to move into the underworld while still alive. We have also touched upon hanging as a ritual, a mock hanging, designed to copy the initiation of Odin as he hung for 9 nights in the world tree. In her study of Seiðr, the Norwegian archaeologist Britt Solli argued that the hanging of the men at Uppsala may have been rituals of initiation where the men hung within the grove in an attempt to follow in the footsteps of the great god of Seiðr. And I heartily agree. I would add that in the Oseberg ship burial, where I argued in chapter 9 that the 2 priestesses presided over various important public ceremonies, such as the royal inauguration and the sacred marriage, a tapestry was found showing 9 men hanging in a grove full of serpents, presided over by 3 females. The similarity between the motif of this Norwegian tapestry dating back to 834 AD and to the later medieval descriptions of the 9 men hanging in the Uppsala Grove is hardly coincidental. We may remember that the Oseberg priestess seemed to have played a role in a ritual of sacred marriage. As we have seen, a symbolical sexual union was very much a part of the mythical initiation structure, even those that had nothing to do with kingship. The embrace of the goddess was the ultimate consecration, the symbolic or actual death that leads to a spiritual rebirth. After centuries of suffering, the theologies of misogynists with severe sexual hang-ups may seem strange to us moderns when sexuality is so obviously associated with spiritual resurrection and with enlightenment. The closest thing we can find in contemporary religions may be in Tantra, where a sexual union is indeed the ultimate metaphor for spiritual wholeness, and even practiced physically in a ritual context. And before I keep reading the rest of this part, I should say that it is interesting that Adam of Bremen says that 9 male victims every day for 9 days are being sacrificed, 1 human alongside 8 different kinds of animals. 9 male creatures, including 1 man, for 9 days. And yet he says that after the 9 days, 72 bodies are still hanging in the grove. The animals were also hanged in the grove. And this tells me something interesting. What happened with if there were 9 days and 9 victims, we should be seeing 81 victims still hanging from the trees in the grove. 81, 9 men and 72 animals. But somehow the 9 men probably are not still hanging in the grove, which tells me that maybe they were hung for 1 day, but not hung to actually die. They were hung in order to achieve some spiritual insight, some sort of initiation, or to show that they could become, kings, leaders, or skalds, or wise men. It seems that all of them did similar things. If you were going to be a king, if you're going to be some sort of chief or leader of men, if you were going to become a skald, a poet, if you wanted to become a berserker, if you want to become a Seiðr, any kind of fjölkingi, great knowledge, could be achieved by following the god's footsteps and undergo this sort of initiation. And so what happened to the 9 missing bodies in the grove? It tells me that maybe it was a mock sacrifice, maybe it was an initiation where only the animals were actually left hanging and probably already butchered. That's what I think, that the missing 9 were the 9 men who were not actually left hanging because they did not actually die. They just went through a spiritual transformation. Now, let's see how much left we have of this. Yeah. The threefold function. The 3 females presiding over the hanging ritual at the Oseberg tapestry, which may be a depiction of initiation trials rather than sacrifice, well, they are shown carrying different symbolic attributes. Now, obviously there are different interpretations of these attributes. I guess I have decided on that the first woman carries a sword, which gives associations to the warrior and to the Valkyria. The second carries a weave, giving association to the Norns and to fate. And the third carries 3 serpents, giving association to Hel, and specifically the transformation, the shedding of skin that happens in the well of Hel. The 3 may represent the threefold goddess, Valkyria, Norn, and Giantess. And they may also represent the 3 possible fates of the initiate, the warrior prince, the poet seer, and the sorcerer sage. 3 gods were indeed associated with the temple of Uppsala. The 3 burial mounds at the site were said to belong to Odin, Freyr, and Thor in folklore. Adam of Bremen also later identifies the idols of the 3 gods as belonging to Odin, Freyr, and Thor, and that Freyr was indeed situated in the middle wearing a huge erect phallus. That's Freyr. In the myths, I have often identified a trinity of gods representing spirit, passion, will, intent, and mind poetry. I have also shown how Odin is the ultimate representation of spirit, whereas Freyr in such a trinity would take the place of the passion, but Thor would take the place of the mind. These 3 qualities of human consciousness must come together in their union with the linen-bright Maiden, the goddess in whose embrace the soul is reborn. The formula of a great goddess and 3 gods is one that is actually repeated throughout the mythology and is recognizable even from Bronze Age rock carvings, where we often see 3 different kinds of gods, one carrying a spear, Odin, one carrying an axe like Thor, and one carrying a sword like Freyr. Not that we know that they were the same, but they could very well have been. It is the Nordic language, the Norse language, actually developed in Scandinavia during the Bronze Age, and it came with a big different invasion from the southeast, the Indo-European one. So the foundations for Old Norse religion and culture actually did happen. The language foundation and probably the rest of what we know to later was begun in the Bronze Age. Before that, there was a different culture here in Scandinavia, which probably some of it has obviously and probably reached into the new one, but basically it changed a lot. Now, a caste and class matter. The three gods. Some may remember the threefold Indo-European class hypothesis of Yggdrasill, but this old die-hard theory does not actually apply to Norse society or to the trinity of the Norse gods. In Yggdrasill's theory of the three functions, Odin represents the king and the priestly caste, Thor represents the warrior caste, and Freyr the peasant class. However, Norse sources clearly show that Odin is more associated with war than Thor is, and that the thunder god is primarily concerned with fertility and marriage as well as protection. In the Hyndluljóð, the thunder god is clearly related to the crowd of thralls and the peasant class, an association that is confirmed by the fact that Thor was obviously a god of the common people worshipped by the common man. Freyr was certainly strongly related to fertility and sexuality, yet he was as much of a king and a origin of royal dynasties as Odin was. And also he was a warrior, and the Skirnismál poem clearly suggests that this prototypical king god also went through spiritual initiation. So the functions of the three gods relating to three distinct classes simply do not fit the bill. Freyr is a king, Odin is a king, even Thor could be a king. And Thor has as much to do with the lower class people and with, actually more, he has a lot to do with the lower class people, the peasant warrior class. So he's also, even in this distinction that you have a lordly class and then a peasant class, warrior class and then a peasant class is not even true, because in the Norse society the peasant class were warriors too. So looking at Viking Age society, we also see that the threefold function theory falters. Scandinavia during the Viking Age was rather flexible when it came to social functions. Every man who could hold a blade was expected to be able to wield it, unless he was a slave. Every free man could and would be a warrior, regardless of social status and occupation. Every man or woman who wished to pursue a spiritual career could do so if the intent was strong enough and the opportunity presented itself. Anyone with a talent for poetry could pursue the art of poetry, and everybody was essentially a farmer, economically dependent on the fertility of the land that their clan tended. In fact, this was more of a clan society than a class society. And although there were clans that would have been more aristocratic and higher than others due to greater riches and long traditions of power, no clan was exclusively concerned with a particular profession. A clan needed to be able to tend to all matters of survival and well-being, to be, as it were, self-sufficient. That meant that they were all farmers, and they were all warriors, and each would nurture the skills of the clan member who showed a talent for a particular craft. No matter how small and insignificant the clan, each head of any household was a priest and priestess in their own right, within their own household. So the important Trinity formula of Old Norse paganism must have had a different meaning that had little to do with class or caste. From my own analysis of the three aspects of awareness, the spirit, the mind and the passion, I deduce that the basic idea behind the Trinity formula originates in a philosophy about human and divine awareness or consciousness rather than in a class structure. As far as I am concerned, the medieval descriptions of the great pagan temple of Uppsala are perfect descriptions of the mythical concepts and themes that have to do with the initiation, where the hero or god walks through the underworld in order to reach the golden hall of the Maiden. Initiations that may very well have been played out and reenacted in greater public rituals, similar to those of Eleusis and to those of the temples of Isis. And that's it for today. Thank you for listening. I'm gonna keep reading. This chapter 12 is quite long, so it might take me 2 more videos before I finish reading this book, and then we have to figure out the new the new projects here on Patreon. So thank you for listening, and have a beautiful day or night or whatever. Bye bye.